All right, so today we're going to conclude this book, really short book, only 3 chapters in Habakkuk, and we're going to finish it up today with Cartwheels of Joy. So give me just a little bit of a recap. So remember, Habakkuk was around 600, usually some people put it in the 630s BC. This is before Christ, or if you're looking at a different way of dating, they also call this the before the Common Era. So the before the Common Era, and it's usually marked by Jesus. But the minor prophet, he brings a message to people, but Habakkuk also was the message that was back to God. And so this is what makes Habakkuk different from some of the other minor prophets, is that there wasn't always this exchange going back and forth. But Habakkuk becomes the message, right? Because his name means to embrace. And we're going to get this at the end. But when we're looking at this idea, he's saying, I have to embrace who God is, even when I don't understand it. I'm going to embrace the ways of God, even when things aren't going my way. There is corruption amongst his people, and he's calling it out. And he's saying, there's corruption, but then God comes back. If you remember in the first chapter, God comes back and says, well, there's going to be a more corrupt nation that's actually going to come in. And he didn't like that. Nobody does. And he concludes with this kind of like, this isn't really fair. God, where are you in the midst of all of these difficulties? Where are you when people are corrupt? It seems like the wicked are trying to win. God, where are you? You see, there's a lot of this that comes up through the book of Habakkuk, and especially there it's highlighted in the first chapter. You see, we want God to do for us what we ask God to do. And we often say, God, we know that you are the one who's in control of all things. We know, God, that you can do amazing and mighty works. Why? Because we've seen it. We know God is able. But will it happen? Will God work as we have requested? Or is God going to find another route? You see, so far in chapter 1 and chapter 2, what we found in chapter 1 was there was 2 complaints that Habakkuk was bringing. Chapter 2 was like there's an exchange that God's trying to be able to make with him and saying, all right, so here's the thing about all of this is that things are going to happen and you may not like them. And then he tells them about Babylonians, and he's like, yep, they're bad people. They're going to get what is coming to them. Just hold on. And now we get to chapter 3. So if you open up your Bibles, chapter 3, what we find in chapter 3 is it opens up in verse 1. This is a prayer that was sung by the prophet Habakkuk. Right? So it's a prayer that is sung by Habakkuk. And if you look at some English translations, they throw in a word and you're like, it seems like it's out of place. So if you look up, even in the NLT, the New Living Translation, there's a footnote on there that actually brings in this word. And it says this, it says that the Hebrews added this, it says, Shigionoth. And you're like, what is this? And it's an interesting word that's kind of like thrown in there. And sometimes because they're like, we don't know what to do with this, it's a word that actually means singing emphatically. Right? So this entire verse right here, this entire chapter 3, is being sung by the prophet. You see, there's a part about being able to bring praise to God, and there's some creative ways in which people have brought these prayers, but also being able to have a conversation with God through song. That he's singing this prayer and he's lifting it up to God, and there's some things that are going to be hard here. In chapter 3, we're going to get into some of the these parts are hard. And yet he's still lifting up this prayer to God. So let's get into verse 2. I have heard all about you, Lord. I am filled with awe by your amazing works. In this time of our deep need, help us again as you did in years gone by. And again, and in your anger, remember your mercy. So, the prophet's saying, I've read the scriptures. We've read the scriptures. God, I've seen what you've done. I know about all the things that you've done in the past. I've seen this amazing things that you can do and that you are able to do. But he's not seeing it now. You see, that's kind of the code word that we find here, because he's saying, I have heard all about you. I've read all about you. I've sang songs all about you. From the things that you've done in the past, it was then. What about now? God, we want to be able to see the things that we have seen you do, we've read about, we've studied, we've dug into, we've seen all of these wonderful things that you've done. We want to see it now. We want to see it today. Because this is what he says, in this time, in our day, help us. Help us to be able to see and remember the things that you have done. And help us to see it today. So Habakkuk does 3 things in order to help him. In order to help us, right? He says the first one is this: remember what God has done. Right, so then we'll go into verse 3. He says, I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. His brilliant splendor fills the heavens, and the earth is filled with his praise. So when we're looking at this, we're probably missing quite a bit, because we're like, these things don't mean much to us. Does anybody know where Edom is? You're like, I mean, we could probably pull it up on a map and be able to say, where was Edom in the Old Testament? You could probably do that. Have you ever heard of Mount Paran? You're like, no, like it's not that common. And yet, when Habakkuk is calling it out and actually singing it out to the people and to God, they know exactly what he's talking about. They know that these places, both out of Edom and into Paran, were the places that God took the people out of slavery in Egypt, and he brought them to a place of refuge. So when he's using places like this as markers, what he's actually looking at is saying, I remember that when you took the people out of the land of slavery, you brought them out and you took care of them. You established them as a people. You showed them your power, but also your grace. We remember these things. And it's good for us to be able to think back at all the ways in which God has brought us out of things to a place of both refuge, strength, our own power. Right? God has done these things. And so we continue, verse 4. His coming is as brilliant as the sunrise. Rays of light flash from his hands where his awesome power is hidden. Pestilence marches before him. Plague follows close behind. When he stops, the earth shakes. When he looks, the nations tremble. He shatters the everlasting mountains and levels the eternal hills. He is the eternal one. I see the people of Cushan in distress and the nation of Midian trembling in terror. You see, here's the part when you're looking at all these pieces again, it's going back to out of the land of slavery. When he's talking about pestilence and plagues, do you remember what it took for them to be able to leave Egypt? You remember all the plagues that hit the land of Egypt in order to be able to shake the Pharaoh, to be able to say, yes, I'm going to let go of free labor. Yes, I'm willing to be able to let these people go because of the power of God that was seen amongst them. These are all pictures of things that God wants to remind the people of, but now Habakkuk saying, I need to remember these things. These things were done in the past, and if we remember the things of God, if we remember what God can do and is able to do, then we can say, God, we're still going to trust you even when we don't see it. Sometimes we need to remember. Last week we talked about this because it also shows up in chapter 2 of Habakkuk. And we said this, we said sometimes in the ways that we need to remember is that we have to write it down. He tells Habakkuk, God tells Habakkuk in chapter 2, verse 2, he says, write this down so that you can remember it. And it's good for us to be able to go back through to say, when has God been faithful in my life where I was able to see it, to pinpoint it, to be able to mark it so that I can remember it. Throughout the Old Testament, this is the way that some people would remember things. Is that when, let's say, so Moses was bringing them out of the land of Egypt, right, out of the land of slavery. Every stop along the way, they would build a little altar. And they'd say, we're going to remember this time because anybody who's going to walk by here is going to see an altar to God and say, here's a moment that we can remember what God has done. What is it that you do to remember the faithful parts of what God has been in your life? What are you doing? Are you marking it? Are you finding a way to be able to say, every time I'm going to pass by this part, every time I'm going to be able to see, I'm going to remember that God's faithfulness was true right here? How do you remember? Today we get to be able to celebrate communion together. In communion, Jesus tells us, when you take and eat and take and drink, you remember what I've done for you. Jesus lived, died, and rose again, and he's saying to you, you need to remember what I've done for you. Because when you forget it, all of a sudden you're like, I don't think God's going to forgive me this time. And Jesus is like, don't you remember what I said? When you take and eat and take and drink, when you're taking the blood of Christ and you're saying, we do this in remembrance of the forgiveness of sins. We remember. Let's not forget. Number 2, we need to accept what God is doing. And this is a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to be able to accept the things that God's doing. So as we kind of move forward, the rest of those verses in between, when we finished with verse 6, is that The rest of those before we get to 16 were all the ways in which they have seen God move, and they're trying to remember it, right? And it's a lot of those things that were out of the land of Egypt. And so we move all the way towards the end of this, and we get to this part. It says, I tremble inside when I heard this. My lips quivered with fear. My legs have gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. I will wait quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. You see, this is the part when he's saying, God, you told me what you're going to do. You told me that the Babylonians are going to come in and they're going to take everything from us. They're going to take some people off with them to live with them in their kingdom. They're going to destroy some of our temples. They're going to destroy some of our houses. They're going to take everything of value from us. I heard what you said. I'm verifying this once again with you, God. Like, I heard it. But this isn't going to be a fun season. You ever looked at that and said, man, I see some of the things that are coming down the line, like this isn't going to be fun. But do you accept it? You're like, God, I heard what you said, and I believe what you're going to do, and yet in this time, it's not fun. My heart hurts. I still see the destruction around me. I still see the people who are wicked, who are thriving. God, this is not a fun season. Because it's in this acceptance part, it's all the stuff that comes before acceptance. It's the anger that pops up before we get to acceptance. It's the anger that says, no, this is not going to be the way. I don't like this season. I'm going to try to be able to find a different season. I want to be able to try to rejoice even in the midst of I'm surrounded by destruction and sorrow. I'm trying to be able to ignore my feelings of anger, of hurt. I'm going to bury all of those feelings, and I'm going to bury it and bury it and bury it till I can't see it anymore. You see, it's all the things that happen before we even get to acceptance is that we're trying to find still another path, even when we know what God has said. So we go back to, can we accept it? Will we accept it? When God's saying this isn't going to be a fun season, are we like, God, well, I'm going to find a different companion to go with me then? I'm going to make my own way? Or God, I'm going to trust you? You see, acceptance breaks us down, right? It breaks us down because we go through all the emotions and all the feelings, and then we get to the place and we say, and yet, God, I am going to trust you today. Because you tell me that you're going to be with me even in the hard stuff. You tell me I'm not going to be alone. And today I'm going to believe it. We can accept the things that God is going to be at work doing. Why? Because God has been faithful in the past. We remember what God has done. What God has done by bringing the people out of the land of slavery. We've seen it time and time again. God continues to bring people out of slavery, bringing them out of oppression, bringing them out of, right? There's all kinds of that. Time and time again, we've seen it occur. That God is doing this work, and so we remember it, and then we can say, God, because I've seen it, and because I remember it today, I'm going to trust and accept it. Because then the third thing, this is what we have to say, is we're going to trust what God is going to do. Right? So it's accept what God is doing, and we're going to trust what God is going to do. Future. So let's read a couple of verses here. Verse 17. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there's no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crops fail and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. So again, hard stuff. What does he say? Verse 17, even when. Right? Even when what? Even when there's no fruit, there's no food. Even when we're cut off. Even when, right? Even when everything comes up empty. Even when there's nothing left and I feel like it's all abandoned. And yet, we're going to rejoice in the God of our salvation. See, this is hard too. And this is what I'm saying. I mean, like, I understand in the book of Habakkuk is both comforting but completely devastating. Because we're saying, like, God, we know that you're going to do something. We know you're going to do something. Right now, it's terrible. And yet we're going to wait. And yet we're going to see the things that God is able to do later. I pray that each of us can have that kind of faith. The faith of Habakkuk, who still struggles. Who's still saying, I got complaints, God. Because the thing is that we can't get to chapter 3 Habakkuk without going through chapter 1 Habakkuk. Chapter 1 Habakkuk says, I can't get there unless I'm actually yelling at God. Unless I'm saying, God, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't like it. Please change it. God, are you awake? Don't you see the things that are happening here? You see, you don't get to this part in chapter 3 when he's saying, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, until we actually are saying, God, I don't understand it, I don't get it, I don't believe it. The type of faith that Habakkuk is getting to in verse 18, and yet I'm going to rejoice in the Lord, comes through trial, comes through questioning. It comes through not understanding. But still on the other side says, and yet we're going to rejoice in you today. We're going to rejoice in your movement. We're going to rejoice and sing your praise because we trust it. Can you trust God with your tomorrow? Can you trust God with your tomorrow when today seems shaky? Can you trust God with your future, even when you're looking at it and saying, He hasn't met my expectation right now. I wanted to be able to see this right now. And yet God says, your tomorrows are in His hands. We trust in this. We believe it. Verse 19. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, is able to tread upon the heights. To me, this is a beautiful image that he's bringing in, poetic imagery. Because he's saying, God, you're going to have to be my strength, because I'm not going to have enough to be able to carry myself and all the people or circumstances around me. God, you're going to have to be my strength through the struggle, through the times that I'm questioning, through the times that I'm yelling, through the times that I'm complaining. God, you need to be my strength. He says, because he wants to say, God, give me feet like a deer. What does a deer's feet do? It's swift. And then it says, God, you're going to create my feet to be able to take me to new heights. You see, this is the things that God can do, and God is trying to bring us to. And he says, trust in me today, because tomorrow I'm going to continue to be able to lift you up. Today, if you trust me, tomorrow there's going to be those times when you're going to be elevated. You're going to be lifted up. But he says, can you embrace the things that you don't understand today? Can you embrace the mystery of God today? Because just like Habakkuk, and his name means to embrace. Even when you don't get what's happening right now, can you embrace this trust, this faith that God has our tomorrows? It's what this book is all about. It's a book that says faith and doubt go hand in hand. There are doubts that we have, and it doesn't mean that our doubt has to take over. It doesn't mean our doubts can to destroy us, but we say, no, help us, God, to be able to balance this with our questions and with our complaints, and still at the end of the day say, God, we're going to trust you. So we learn trust. We learn faith. And we continue to grow in it. In Jesus' name. Please stand and pray with me.